Welcome back to the channel. Matt here. This is going to be part 3 in our FSFO version 5 tutorial series, in which we are going to discuss all the configuration options available to you. For those of you that have used FSFO in the past, you know it's a highly flexible and adaptable virtual copilot program, so I thought it would be a good idea to explain each one of these options in some depth. To access the configuration screen, it's quite easy. From the FSFO main menu, just click on Setup. A secondary screen will appear. For this tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to start up here in the left corner, work our way down, and then over to the right, and iterate through all the subscreens available to us. First thing we want to do is we want to set up our audio outputs. After all, Virtual Copilot program is no good if you can't hear the pilot or the copilot. Click on the arrow here, and this will display all the output devices detected. I have mine right now set to my Alienware Bluetooth headsets. Once you select your output device, you want to test it to make sure it works.
Run a full right. Flaps 40.
Great. So now we know both we can hear the pilot and copilot. We will move down to the flight crew. Traditionally, I have my flight crew set to my speaker as my output because I like to create the ambiance that the flight crew is not in the cockpit with me or on the same intercom frequency. So traditionally I have this again on my speakers, but because I am recording this video, everything is being run through my headset and I want you to hear what it is I'm doing. So let's go ahead, now that we have our output device selected, let's go ahead and test our flight crew.
Dear passengers, this is to inform you the aircraft doors have been closed. In order to push back on time, all passengers must be seated with your seatbelts fastened. All luggage must be stored in the overhead bin or under the seat in front of you. The cabin crew will be passing through to make their final safety checks before pushback. Thank you and welcome aboard.
Okay, so we know that is working. Note right here, the little checkbox right here, if this checkbox was checked, instead of hearing that message that you just heard, the safety message that was just played, you would hear this.
Welcome to your flight. On its way to one of our many destinations across the globe. Made possible.
All right, that is a video recording message or a recorded message from a major U.S. carrier. Some of you may note that's what will play if you have this check enabled. Now, if you don't want to hear that particular message, but instead want to hear the recorded message from the airline that you are intending to mimic, let's say, for example, Delta or US Airways, all you have to do is download that carrier's safety message and then move it to your, go to your FSFO directory, find the sounds folder, the systems folder, and just copy it in here and then name it safetymsg.wave. Name it just like you see here. With this checked, FSFO would play that for your safety message, vice the traditional safety message that we first started with. So that gives you some flexibility to use your preferred airline's initial message, vice the ones that are shipped with FSFO. Moving down to the Runway Awareness and Alert System, otherwise known as RAS. We'll discuss that more once we get down to the option. For now, we just want to make sure the output device is configured correctly. What I traditionally do is I set my RAS to the same output device as my pilot output. And again, that's for realism. All right, with that set, let's go ahead and test it.
3,000 feet remaining.
Okay, great. So all of our output devices are configured correctly. Let's move down to regions. What region is an option? It allows you to select different accents from around the world. As you can see, we have several available to you. Most of these are, recorded via Microsoft Azure, which is the same cognitive AI that Microsoft Flight Simulator uses. So in some cases, you'll be able to match your Microsoft Flight Simulator Copilot with what's available in FSFO. Note that if you do choose to download a different region pack, FSFO will download the file from my website, and it will write it to its own directory, which means you're going to need elevated permissions on that folder. So you'll have to run FSFO in admin mode, which we demonstrated how to do in part 1. Quite simple, just right-click on the directory and run as administrator. This will be the only time that FSFO will need administrative privileges in version 5. Note that there's another option available, and that is SAPI, which is Microsoft Synthetic Speech Engine. If we select that, FSFO will, again, use SAPI vice any of the pre-recorded messages. SAPI is, there's no middle ground here. Either you love SAPI or you kind of hate SAPI. There are some advantages to using it. For one, excuse me, FSFO lets you go ahead and dictate what it is your cabin crew says to the passengers. So, for example, if you did not like this text right here that FSFO would read back during the safety message, you could alter it to say whatever it is you wanted. And this is true for all the flight attendant messages that are embedded within FSFO. Again, highly adaptable. Type whatever it is you want, and the SAPI engine would read it back. Another advantage is if you're using an ATC program that has an embedded first officer, you could have your FSFO first officer sound just like that ATC first officer, which again helps with the realism and the ambiance. So those are the two major advantages for using SAPI. Windows usually ships with two SAPI options, and they are Microsoft David and Microsoft Zira. However, if you had purchased other options and had them installed on your machine, they would all be available here for you to choose from. Unfortunately, all I have is the default one, so poor Microsoft Zira is going to have to both fly the aircraft and perform duties as the flight crew in our demonstration. Closing this out with the region set to SAPI, we will go ahead and retest the pilot voices to hear the difference.
Hello, I'm your synthetic copilot.
Hello, I'm your synthetic pilot.
And here's poor Zira doing a safety message.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, please turn off all electronic devices.
So that's the SAPI, again, FSFO, highly configurable. I like to use English 1, primarily because it contains my voice and what's not to like about my voice. Kidding, of course. Moving down to pilot's volume, this allows you to select whatever volume it is you desire. With it selected way down, let's go ahead and test.
Run a full right. Flaps 40.
As you can hear, it's really low. I like to keep my pilot's voice up and my crew volume low. Again, that's to create the ambience that we discussed prior with the co-pilot or with the flight crew not actually being in the cockpit, but being having a door between us and them. So there's the audio output. Let's move down to joystick key options. And we'll discuss each one of these before discussing how to set them within FSFO. The first one is push to talk. Now, push to talk has two actions depending on how you have open mic set. Open mic is the option that if set, which it is now, it's enabled. FSFO will constantly listen for your speech commands once you enable the speech recognition engine, which I just did by clicking on the microphone here. If open mic is enabled and push to talk is also configured, what would happen is every time you push this button with open mic enabled, FSFO would stop listening. So it kind of has the opposite effect of push to talk. It's actually push to not listen. And this is valuable if you're using, let's say, vPilot, which is the application that Simmers use to connect to the VATSIM network. What you should do is configure your vPilot push to talk button to the same push to talk button you have within FSFO. So what would happen is when you push to talk to the ATC controller, FSFO would stop listening. So that would create the scenario where there wouldn't be any miscommunication or commands interpreted that were directed towards the ATC controller and have your co-pilot interpret them as, let's say, set the flaps. So that's why that's important. If you had open mic disabled, then when you depress the push to talk button is when your co-pilot would actually start listening to you. Without the push to talk button pressed, he just wouldn't listen to you. So that is the difference between push to talk with open mic enabled and open mic disabled. Highly configurable. The mute option, what this is in this case, if I were to push a button 11 on my joystick, the copilot would just stop listening until I push the button again. Mute is depicted via the microphone. This would turn from green to yellow, and you know it's muted. I like this option because I do fly with open mic enabled. And when I get in airborne mode, there's not much about the communication once you're in the air between the pilot and the co-pilot. So I enable mute so there's no background noise that gets misinterpreted as a command. Bypass button, what that is during several phases of flight, there'll be actions in which FSFO will ask you, let's say, to push the control plus alt button to move to the next item. This mimics that. So instead of pushing control plus alt, you can simply press this button and FSFO would move to the next action. Could also be useful during a checklist. If you do not want to set the checklist item to whatever it is FSFO is looking for, you just click this button and the copilot would just move to the next checklist item. The action button, what this does is it go ahead and it initiates the next action within sequence. So for example, if I were to push the action button right now, it would go ahead and initiate the pre-flight flow. If the pre-flight flow was completed and I hit the action button again, it would initiate the pre-flight checklist and so forth. Now, if the taxi checklist was completed and you push this button, he would then go right to the before takeoff checklist. He does the next sequential action within the aggregate flow pattern, if you will. So this is just a mechanism. If you don't want to use voice command and you don't want to interact with the GUI, you could simply configure an action button and then FSFO would act accordingly. Minimize, setting this button here. If the program is not minimized, FSFO will become minimized when you press this button. If it is minimized, if you press this button again, it will then reappear on your screen. All right, let's go ahead and talk about how to configure your device. If I were to try to set the push to talk button now, I would get a warning saying, please set your device. So what you want to do is come down here. I'm going to select my Thrustmaster A320. You'll notice the GUID will appear here. If the GUID does not appear here, we have a problem and you will not be able to set your buttons. All right, so with our device set, GUID appearing, what I will do now is click the set button. And for your buttons, you want to press it 2 times. There you go. So now the push to talk button is set to button 11 on my Thrustmaster joystick. Now, if I also wanted to set some key bindings, you can do that now in version 5 by simply selecting keyboard, and then you would just do the same exact thing. Click set, and now all you have to do is hit whatever key you want one time. I'm going to use M for mute, and there we go. So now my keyboard mute option is set to M, and that is all there is to it. Just a word of caution. Make sure when you set buttons within FSFO that you clear them within Microsoft Flight Simulator. So M actually has a corresponding action within the sim. I want to make sure I clear that out in order to not accidentally trigger another action within the simulator. All right, let's move down to the user options. The first option is SimBrief ID, and that's coupled to the download flight plan. If this is enabled, FSFO will go ahead and download my latest SimBrief flight plan as long as I have my ID entered here. And as you can see, he's already done that, or the program already did that when I launched, as indicated by SimBrief plan downloaded. This has to be your SimBrief ID, which is a numeric value, not your SimBrief username. Those are 2 separate things. Also note for those of you who've used in the past, you no longer have to worry about that annoying leading 0 or trailing 0. Apologize for that, but that's gone now in version 5. So download flight plan, we already discussed. When FSFO launches, it will look for your latest SimBrief flight plan and download it into the FSFO plan page. And there it is. All right, we already discussed open mic, which brings us to RAS, the Runway Advisory and Alert System. What this is it's meant to alert the pilot and co-pilot to give them advisories while they're on the ground. For example, if I were to move my throttles to the takeoff position and I was not on a runway, the RAS system would go on taxiway, advising the pilots that they are not on an active runway. It will also advise them when they're approaching the runway as well as when they're on the runway. During the takeoff roll, if it happens to be a long takeoff roll and you're running out of room to rotate, you would hear the copilot call out 3,000 feet remaining, 2,000 feet remaining, and 1,500 feet remaining. It also works while you're airborne. During the approach phase of flight, if you're in 1.5 miles from the runway threshold and you're within the runway corridor, rectangle corridor, the ROS system will say approaching runway 15 left. And then once you land, if you happen to have a long rollout, it will advise you when you have 3,000 feet of runway remaining to 1 and so forth. That is the runway advisory and alert system. Arrival updates, if this is enabled, during the airborne phase of flight, you would continue to get updates every 2 minutes on what time you're expected at your destination, as well as fuel burn numbers. And it also displays the closest airport to you in case you have to make an emergency landing. Career mode, we will discuss this more during the company and fleet portion of the tutorial. Just note, if this is enabled, FSFO will look to ensure that the options here that are set within the company page are satisfied before it allows you to begin your flight. Kilograms, if you want to hear readback numbers, for example, fuel, if you want to hear those in kilograms, vice pounds, simply enable that, and that's how that would work. Verbose mode, what that is during flows. By definition, flows have no communication between the pilot and the co-pilot. They are based on airline standard operating procedures, and pilots perform them without any coordination between the two. Verbose mode kind of bypasses that. What it will do is the co-pilot will make verbal announcements before he touches any system. For example, he will say powering up aircraft, setting fuel pumps, setting lights, so forth, so forth. The reason that exists is for our blind flight simming community, who obviously rely more on verbal cues than visual cues, and I wanted to do something special for them because they were a great supporter of FSFO Pro, which is 2 or 3 iterations of FSFO ago. So that's in there for them. We'll continue to try to help our blind simming community, which is just full of some great and amazing people. That's verbose mode. Over here on the FSFO options, we're going to move over now and talk about our SOPs. Before doing so, I want to bring your attention to the asterisks. Note that everything with an asterisk can be disabled by simply typing a 0 in the box, and that's how you would disable that. Acceleration altitude above ground level, what that is this is the altitude above the ground. So if you're at 200 feet, you would still have to climb to 1,500 feet in order for this to trigger. That differs from MSL, which doesn't take the current ground altitude into account when it determines where you are within the air. For example, if you're at Denver, you're already at about 6,000 feet, for example. You would only have to climb 4,000 feet before getting to 10,000 feet mean sea level. That's the difference between AGL and MSL. So in this example, once you got to 1,500 feet above ground altitude, you will hear the co-pilot call out acceleration altitude, which is the cue for the pilot flying to pitch the nose down to start gaining speed for the second segment of the climb phase. Set to 10,000 feet. When the aircraft reached this altitude, he would go ahead and turn off the landing lights. Conversely, on the approach phase, once he fell below this altitude, he would turn the landing lights on. Engage VNAV once the aircraft reached 1,800 feet. For the, let's say, the PMDG 737, he would engage vertical navigation or VNAV. And for this, for the Airbus A320, he would engage managed climb mode. Engage LNAV, same principle. Once the aircraft reached 400 feet, for the PMGG 737, you would engage LNAV. For the Airbus, they would engage managed mode. Note that for this option right here, engage LNAV, that is directly tied to the planning page SID option. If you have no selected, the co-pilot will assume it's going to be an ATC vector departure, in which case, instead of selecting LNAV, he would select heading select. So that is directly tied to this option. If you select yes, then he's going to determine that you're on a standard instrument departure with no ATC vectors, and then we'll select LNAV and manage mode. Autopilot on, just like it sounds. Once the aircraft hits 1,800 feet, the autopilot would be turned on. Conversely, it works the same for autopilot disconnect. Once you fall below 450 feet on the landing phase of the flight, the copilot would turn off your auto throttles, and same with the autopilot off. Pretty self-explanatory, again, on the landing phase of flight. Gear extension. Now, this right here is directly tied to the option set landing gears. So with this enabled, with set landing gears enabled, what this would do is once the aircraft reached 2,000 feet on the landing phase, the copilot would extend the landing gear. Now, you may ask why the two options to do the same thing, and that's a good question. What this does, it provides some flexibility. So if you had set landing gear enabled and you had this set to 0, what that would do is the copilot would raise the gear on takeoff, but not touch the gear on landing. What I find is a lot of flight simmers want a little help during the takeoff phase of flight, which is a little busier, especially if you're flying on the VATSIM network and you're trying to communicate with the ATC controllers and still managing all the system. But the approach phase isn't all that isn't as busy as the takeoff phase. So they want a little flexibility in what the copilot can do. That's why this option is directly tied to the option set landing gear. Okay. Minimum takeoff extension flaps works a lot like the previous option in that it is directly tied to set flaps. You have to have this enabled for this to matter. What this is FSFO will not start extending the flaps until the aircraft is below this altitude. This prevents any misunderstanding between the speech recognition program, if you will. So you don't want to extend the flaps when the aircraft is at like 23,000 feet. Now, it does not matter if you fall below the clean speed, which is the speed required to extend your flaps. FSFO will not extend them until you are below this altitude. So make sure you're paying attention to your speed and extend your flaps accordingly. Again, the reason this is tied to the set flaps option here is because if you want FSFO to manage the flaps on takeoff, i.e. retract them, but not touch them on the approach phase, then what you would do is have this option set to on, and then there you go, set a 0 into here, and then FSFO would not touch them during the landing phase of flight, but would retract them on the takeoff phase. Ground speed warning. Once the aircraft surpass 30 miles an hour here, the copilot will warn the captain, watch the ground speed. Runway lights off. What this is the turnoff runway. So after you complete the shutdown flow, what would happen, or not the shutdown flow, I apologize, the after landing flow, and the aircraft falls below 5 miles an hour, the copilot would automatically turn off the runway turnoff lights. This is to prevent the aircraft from blinding the ground crew when the aircraft turns into the gate. Set that to 0, and then you can manage that via voice if you so choose. Moving down, the next two options are linked. GPU and copilot piloting up aircraft. If this was set to no, then it really wouldn't matter what this is set to. If this is set to yes, you're telling the program that you want the copilot to power up the aircraft when FSFO connects to it. If this was set to no, what would happen is during the pre-flight flow, the copilot would wait for you, the captain, to go ahead and establish power to the aircraft before beginning their flows. Note that GPU is a ground power unit. The other option is the APU, which is an auxiliary power unit. It's nothing more than a small jet engine. Most SOPs require a GPU because 1, it's far more fuel efficient. 2, it's less wear and tear on the APU. Again, it's a jet engine, so the more you use it, the more it needs to be maintained. And 3rd, the APU creates a lot more noise. So at some airports that have close residential areas, GPU is required for noise abatement procedures. If you're looking to save time, though, then you would want your copilot to start with APU, which will make the pre-start flow move much faster. I do have my copilot set to yes, I want him to establish power, and yes, I want him to start it using the GPU. No power equals self-test. I have this set to yes. What this is, if I connect FSFO to the simulator right now, you'll notice the Airbus A320 is in a cold and dark state. So when FSFO connects and it detects the cold and dark, it will assume this is the first flight of the day, and thus you will have to perform some system tests. For example, if you look at the PMDG 737 pre-flight flow, look at all these tests that have to be performed. If you were to select no here, FSFO would not conduct those tests regardless of whether or not you identified them to be conducted within the editor or not. If you select yes, and the copilot detects that the power is established, he would also not perform those tests because, again, he would assume this is not the first flight of the day, so those tests have already been performed according to the airline SOPs. Moving on, a couple taxi to landing lights. What that is anytime the landing lights are turned on, so are the taxi lights, required by some airlines, most notably Delta. The same with the next option, couple runway to landing lights. Anytime landing lights are turned on, so too will the runway turn off lights. Logo wing lights on at night. If you identify the logo and wing lights within the editor to be turned on, FSFO would only turn them on if it's at nighttime to save some money on the bulbs for these. Seatbelt policy, you can have your copilot automatically turn off the seatbelts at a designated time during the flight phase. There are three options. The two automated options is if the aircraft reached 10,000 feet, the copilot would turn the seatbelt signs off on the takeoff phase, and then he would turn them on during the approach phase once the aircraft reached this altitude. The other option is takeoff, top of climb and top of descent. So once you reach the altitude designated on the planning phase, which is right here, planned altitude. In this scenario, once the aircraft reached 28,000 feet, the copilot would turn the seatbelt signs to off. Conversely, once I reached the top of descent, he would then turn them back on. That's the seatbelt policy. I'm going to keep it on top of climb, top of descent. Okay, approach on with glide slope alive. So I have this set to yes, meaning when the copilot sees the needle on his PFD move indicating that the glide slope is alive, he would then turn on approach mode in the aircraft automatically. I have that set to yes. There are our standard operating procedures. Let's go ahead and move on to our options. As you can see, autoflow is enabled. What this does is when you have that on, the pre-flight flow would go ahead and start when you connect FSFO to the sim. So if I were to connect this right now and autoflow is enabled, he would start his pre-flight flow. The before start flow would start when all the doors on the aircraft are shut. Moving over to the after start flow would automatically be initiated when the aircraft, all the engines are stabled and the parking brake is set, then the after start flow would proceed. Moving over to the next page, the after landing flow would automatically start once the aircraft fell below a certain speed, which is indicated over here, 20 miles an hour in this case, but it's configurable, and we'll talk more about that when we get to it. But that's when the after landing flow would start. The shutdown flow would start when you initiate the parking brake at the destination airport. So these are the automated flows. There are no automated checklists. Again, you will have to call them, use the action button, or press the button to initiate the flow. The rudder and the flight control test, if you have that enabled and you have the flight control test identified within your checklist or within your editor, and you'll have to excuse me, it's going to have to take me just a minute to find it. It's somewhere in here, whatever. Within the editor, once the copilot performed the flight control, he would also include the rudders. Right now I have that disabled because I typically perform my flight control tests as I'm taxiing out, and I don't have a tiller configured. I have my rudder pedals, so I don't want to look like I'm crazy with swaying my jet to the left and right, checking my rudders for the flight control. So that's why I have that disabled. Cabin messages, we talked a little bit about that earlier. This is messages from the flight crew. If you enable that, You'll hear a safety message being displayed from the crew, as well as a welcome message and some other message that will occur periodically during the flight. If you have a third-party application that provides the same service, I recommend turning this off. Cabin messages have never been FSFO strong suit. It's primarily a copilot program, but it does add them in there, again, for a value proposition. Pilot message, same thing. During certain segments of the flight, you'll hear the copilot. For example, during the taxi phase, you'll hear a welcome aboard. Again, the top of climb and top of descent, he'll come on with a message to the crew. Configuration warning. What this is anytime the aircraft doors are open and the engines are running, you'll get a warning, as well as if you enter the runway threshold and your flaps is set to 0, you will also get the warning, as well as some other really major configuration problems that the aircraft is in per its flight phase. Set landing gear, we already talked about that, as well as the set flaps. I think we talked about that enough on the SOPs for you to get an idea what that is. Set altimeters, exactly what it sounds. So when the aircraft passes transition altitude on the climb phase, the copilot will set the altimeters to standard. Conversely, when you pass through the transition altitude on the approach or landing phase, he will set the altimeters to the outside pressure at that time. Set center tanks for aircraft that have center fuel, like the PMDG 737, and their systems are not automatically automated. The copilot would turn off the fuel pumps when their center tanks fell below 1,000 pounds. It's traditionally 1,000 pounds or something similar. You never want to let the tanks go completely empty. That means the pumps are working with no fuel being passed through them. So you set them to off before it gets to that point. Set copilot MFD FMC during certain segments of the flight. You'll notice that the copilot will manipulate his multifunction display and his FMC to certain pages. If you prefer to do both them yourself because you want to set them to your preferences, go ahead and disable that, and the copilot will not touch his MFD or FMC or MCDU. Call V-speeds just like it sounds. If you have that enabled, the copilot will call a V1, VR. Nobody really traditionally calls V2. That's a speed that doesn't get called. In order for this to work, though, you have to make sure you have speeds populated within the plan phase. For most aircraft, like the PMDG 737, those will automatically populate it for you. However, for the Phoenix A320, you have to input these yourself, as I cannot read these from the aircraft profile. Moving down, callback numbers. What this is when the copilot, let's say, called during a checklist, he said MCP. Instead of just saying set, he would then call back the numbers. For example, say speed 183, altitude 360, so forth and so forth, if you have this enabled. It's the same when you hear fuel. Instead of just saying checked, he would read back the actual fuel in the tanks. So that's what callbacks numbers is. Call engine start is during the startup phase. The copilot will call out if the engine A has been fired or if the switches have been set back to the ground position for you. So you'll hear engine 1 cut out, as well as engine 1 fired at the right times. And then finally, when all engines are running and they're stabilized, you'll hear engine stable. Call takeoff and landing roll. What that is during the, let's say during the takeoff phase for the Boeing aircraft, you'll hear at 45 knots, you'll hear you'll hear speed alive. At 80 knots, you'll hear 80 knots. And then obviously the V1, V2. It works a little differently for the Airbus. The Airbus call out, you'll hear speed alive at 45, but instead of hearing 80 knots, you'll hear 100 knots. So that's what the call takeoff. Landing roll is the same. During the landing roll, you'll hear call outs such as spoiler out, manual braking, and then speeds at 80, 70, and 60 knots. So that's what the roll calls. If you don't want to hear anything during the takeoff and landing rolls, you would just have this disabled. Call roll responses. This is linked to this option right here. So after the copilot would say 45 knots, if you have this enabled, the pilot would then say checked. Once you called 80 knots, the copilot again would say checked. This exists because if you wanted to vocalize those commands yourself, you would simply disable this, and then you could mimic the responses by having them played automatically for you. Call 400 feet, just like it sounds on the takeoff phase of flight. During the climb out, once the aircraft passes 400 feet, you'll hear a 400-foot call, which is traditionally the altitude that you would engage a lateral mode. Call minimums. This is linked again to this right here, this option within the planning. Once the aircraft fell below, in this case, 200 feet, then you would hear minimums called out. Call ground speed alive. Again, that is the, not ground speed, call glide slope alive. If that's enabled, when the glide slope from the ILS is detected and you have movement within the needle, the copilot will call glide slope alive, meaning you can then intercept the ILS localizer. Call system changes. What that is enabled is, let's say, for example, LNAV is enabled. The copilot would call LNAV on, VNAV on, or he would also call out the current flaps position. This example, if you move the flaps from 1 to 2, you would hear the call out flaps 2, and so forth. So if you don't want to hear those system changes being announced by the copilot, you would just disable that. There are our options. Let's keep moving and move on to operations. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a quick break to get something to drink, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back with you. FSFO contains a lot of ground service actions. Again, a lot of automated options, and that's what this right here, these options are intended to mimic. The first one is ground service. This is the one option, let's say, to control them all. So if this was disabled, none of this matters. This just allows instead of the tedious task of shutting all these off, you could just turn that one off if you didn't want to use any of FSFO's ground service features. The next one is GSX integration. If this is enabled and you enable this, instead of using Microsoft Flight Simulator default ground service options, FSFO would manipulate the GSX menu to go ahead and request these services. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress through. The first one is ground service includes Jetway. So what will happen is when FSFO connects, he will go ahead and trigger the Jetway. If GSX is not enabled, he will just use the default Microsoft Flight Simulator gateway. If GSX is enabled, he would then manipulate the screen or manipulate the GX menu to go ahead and request the Jetway be attached. Ground service includes packs and cargo. So this is kind of important. If GSX is enabled, then FSFO would use, the GSX menu to request boarding via GSX. If this GSX is not enabled, FSFO would use its own passenger simulation to go ahead and start boarding the aircraft. And down right here in this screen right here, you would see passengers being boarded. I want to be clear, there are no physical passengers like GSX. It is purely a simulation without the visual representation. That is well beyond the scope of a virtual copilot program. But it does give you at least the option to mimic passengers being boarded to give you something to wait for. Ground services included catering. Again, depending on whether or not you have GS integration enabled. If you don't, FSFO will just use the embedded catering within Microsoft Flight Simulator. If not, use the menu to request catering. Same goes with fuel. This needs to be worked on a little bit more for the GSX portion because they just completed an update which kind of altered this a little bit, so I need to go back and update it. I don't know if I'm going to get to this before I release version 5 because I've waited too long already. So be on the lookout for an update to enhance this option here. GX services includes push. If you have this enabled, once you got through the before start flow, FSFO would even request the pushback from GSX with this option enabled, along with GSX enabled and ground services enabled. Note that this is only for GSX and not for the embedded Microsoft Flight Simulator pushback tug. GSX includes engines. With this enabled, once the engines are started and they're both stabilized, FSFO would call up the GSX menu to confirm engine start, so you don't have to do that yourself. Again, these two are linked directly to GSX only. Ground services include sound. So what that is if you're not using GSX integration and you are using ground services include packs and cargo, and FSFO's embedded pack simulation was started, you would hear sounds in the background of passengers boarding the aircraft. These sounds would not play if you are using GSX integration because GSX comes with its own sounds that you would hear, and you wouldn't want them overlapping. Conversely, there are some other really great programs that include passenger boarding sounds, so you can disable that either way, so you're not getting a repeat of the sounds. Ground services include doors. What that is when power is established to the aircraft, the copilot would go ahead and open the left forward entry door of that particular aircraft. I have that disabled right now. I'm actually going to enable that because I like that feature. Flight services fully automated. If you have this enabled, this is really associated with career mode, but you can use it anyways. FSFO would go ahead and let the flight crew manage the food and beverage services to the passengers, vice you doing so via the buttons, which we will discuss a little bit more once we talk about the main menu. If flight services wasn't fully automated, you would have to come down here and instruct the flight attendant to go ahead and start serving the passengers, vice just letting them do it all on their own. All right, so that's flight services. Save aircraft log location with logbook, that's enabled. Every time you upload your data to your current logbook at the end of the flight, FSFO would also save your aircraft location. This is linked to this option right here, which is ask to move aircraft to save location. So when you connect FSFO, what it would do is it would look for if that aircraft that you currently have loaded has a saved location, and it would prompt you, would you like to FSFO to move the aircraft to your last saved location? So you don't need to remember which gate you parked at or which airport you're at. FSFO would just move your aircraft to the last recorded location. Down here, packs and cargo boarding time. This is linked to FSFO's simulated packs. If you wanted the packs to hurry up and board the aircraft, you would move the slider over to the left. If you wanted more realistic times, you would move it more over to the right. The same applies to the cabin service time. This is the time it takes them to serve food and drinks. More realism to the right, quicker to the left. That is operations in a nutshell. A lot of the operations commands are tied to the advanced. So let's go ahead and jump right into the advanced tab. Pre-flight flow delay, we have that set to 30 seconds. Remember, we talked about the auto flow options is enabled. And when we connect FSFO to the simulator, it would automatically start pre-flight flow. Well, this is the option that gives you a little bit of time. So what would happen now, since I do have auto flow enabled and I have a delay set in 30 seconds, when I connect FSFO to my simulator, you would see a countdown of 30 seconds before the pre-flight flow started. This is important to me because it gives me a chance to quickly look over at the plans page to make sure that my SimBrief flight plan downloaded correctly before the copilot started his or her flow. Before start flow delay, if you recall, we said with auto flow enabled that the copilot would go ahead and start his before start flow when the aircraft doors were closed. Well, this puts a delay of 10 seconds between the door and the actual flow start time. Same with the after start flow, set to 5 seconds right now. So once all the engines are started and stable and you have the parking brake set, the copilot would count down from 5 seconds before actually initiating the flow. Same with the shutdown flow. Once you're at the destination airport and you set your parking brake, he would wait 5 seconds before actually starting that shutdown flow. Jetway disconnect is set to 20 seconds. So what that is after you complete the before start checklist, the copilot would wait 20 seconds before he disconnects the jetway from the aircraft. Catering and fuel services, this is 60-second delay from the time the aircraft has powered up. So once you establish power to the aircraft or FSFO detects there is power to the aircraft during the pre-flight flow, he would count down 60 seconds to go ahead and request catering services. 60 seconds from the catering service, he would request fuel services. So there's a 60-second gap between catering and fuel, and it's all predicated on this option right here. Request pushback delay, if you recall, this is for the GSX. Once you complete the before start checklist, the copilot would wait 20 seconds before requesting pushback from the GSX menu. Moving down, packs and cargo delay. Again, this is set to 240-second delay from the time the aircraft power is detected during the before start flow. So start the before start flow, you put the main batteries on, that's power to the aircraft, and a countdown of 240 seconds will begin, and the aircraft will start the passenger boarding either via the GSX menu or the FSFO passenger simulation option. After landing flow, we already talked about that. Once you get to the destination airport and the aircraft falls below 24 miles an hour with autoflow enabled, he will automatically start the after landing flow. Flow delays. This is the time between each flow action that the copilot will wait. So if you think the flows are moving just too fast and you want to slow them down, you could put the second between delay between flow actions here. Whatever you want to put, it's in 0.5 increments. So if you want to use fractions, you absolutely can. Well, for example, 2.5 if you wanted the flows to be more realistic. The same principle applies to the checklist delays. The copilot would slow down the time between one checklist call and another checklist call based on this option right here. All right. The reason why this is called the advanced tab is because these are all the options which aren't quite main options, which I never really intended to put in the program, but users have asked for. Again, I will typically do whatever I can to make FSFO work for individual flight simmers. That's what I'm all about, to try to meet the needs of the people who purchase this program or use this program. And that's what this is a representation of. These are things that users have asked for. I hope I made them, I named them so they're quite clear what they do, but we'll go ahead and briefly explain these. I know full well, though, that eventually we're going to add a lot more to these as simmers request more options. So the first one is called PMGG 737B1. For those PMGG pilots, you know that within the FMC, there's an option to have the system call out B1 as opposed to the copilot. This will, if you set this to 1, what will happen is FSFO will call the V1 speed that's entered into the V1 setting here. I have it set to 0, which means he will not call it. So 0 is off or no, 1 is on or yes. The reason why I have this set to 0 is because I have that PMDG option set to yes. So the plane, the aircraft system will call it V1. I don't need the copilot to do it too. Include airports in departure and in airports departure brief. So what that is during the departure briefing, you'll hear the copilot call out, this flight is from Kilo, Bravo, Romeo, so forth, so forth. Some flight simmers don't want to hear the call out like that. So if you set this to 1, then the copilot will include the airports in the departure briefing. If you set it to 0 like it is here, he will not include that. Skip flight plan check. I have that set to 0. If you set that to 1, he will skip it. I recommend that you do not skip it because the flight plan, which is depicted right here, is a critical component of FSFO. If you do not have this filled in, your copilot will not function correctly. For example, he'll have no idea which altitude the top of climb should be predicated on. So I have this set to 0. Recommend you keep it to 0 too. Airport's name when using SAPI. When you get to the destination airport, the copilot will actually call out the airport name rather than the Kilo, Bravo, Romeo, so forth, so forth. Announce flows start. As I said before, flows are by definition no communication between the pilot and copilot. But some users ask for this, so it's easy to do. I put it in there. If you wanted to hear the copilot, for example, say beginning pre-flight flow and pre-flight flow completed, you would just enter a 1 here, and then you could hear that. Call flap changes. This is set to 1. Remember we talked about this option when we talked about the call system changes. We have this set to on, so the Copilot will call any flap changes it detects. Well, sometimes this can wreak havoc for individuals who are using Axis, right, to control their flight, manipulate their flaps, and you'll hear a whole bunch of readouts as the hardware traverses through that axis. So in order to prevent those erroneous flap calls out, you can just set this to 0, and the Copilot would not call flap changes. That's how you can get around that. All right, call speed check vice flap settings. Some airline SOPs, instead of saying the actual flaps 20, they will call out speed check, which is an indication for the pilots to look at the PFD to make sure that their speed is below the thresholds of the directed or the intended flap settings to prevent damage to the flap. So depending on which airline you fly for will depend on if you want that setting set to or not. Moving down, we have call speed. I'm sorry, we already went. Remind captain to program SID and star. That's predicated based on if you have the Copilot programming your FMC or MCDU. He could do everything for you but program the SIDs and stars. So if you have this set to 1, what will happen is once he either completes the init A page for the Airbuses or inputs the route for your Boeing aircraft, once he gets all that done, he will then make a verbal warning asking you to, hey, sir, hey, captain, can you please check this SIDs and stars? Or there's a variation of the request, but it's basically there just to remind you, hey, captain, you have to set those SIDs and stars. That's the one thing I can't do. I have that set to 1 because I like that reminder. Verify exit, set to 0. If this was set to 1, when you close FSFO, we'll ask you are you sure you want to close FSFO? I have that set to 0. Check brakes on taxi out, that's set to 1. So when you're taxiing out the aircraft, you'll hear the Copilot call brake check, in which case the Copilot would then have to tap the brakes to ensure they're working before you progress to the next item. Play ding before crew messages. Remember we heard that ding, and then the Copilot went on, or excuse me, the flight crew went on to discuss the safety message. Well, if you didn't want to hear that ding dong, then you would just hit 0 again. Remember, 0 is off or no, 1 is on or yes. If there's anything that you want this program to do that isn't quite in there as the main options or SOPs, let me know. This is the appropriate place where we can add it to make FSFO work for you. Moving on to the GUI, what this is right here, auto connect to Emma. If this was engaged or on, when you start FSFO, it would automatically look for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and if it found it, it would connect to it automatically without you having to push the connect button right here. I like control over that because you should not start FSFO until you are in the cockpit ready to fly. Auto open enclosed checklist. With that enabled, when you were to start a flow or checklist, FSFO would automatically open the checklist page, and this is where the intended actions would be depicted. Once the flow or checklist is open, he would automatically close it and go back to the home page. App on top, well, that's exactly what it sounds. This ensures that the app stays on top of whatever application is on your screen. Check FSUIPC. That is enabled so to ensure that you are at least using the minimum version of FSUIPC required when you start FSFO. Check for updates. Also, it will go out and to see if there's a new update available to download when that is enabled. I have that off because I know when there's a new update available. This is opacity, or you can kind of see here that you can look through FSFO, and that's predicated on here. If you want to make it more translucent, you can do so by moving the left. More solid, just move it to the right. This option does require a restart. Well, guys, that is every single option available to you in FSFO. Please note that there will be a lot more being added along the way. If you forget, no worries. All you have to do is hover your cursor over the label tab, and that will tell you exactly what it is that each one of these options do. Okay, so that is part 3 out of the way. Next up will be part 4, where we briefly illustrate how you can record your own sounds to use within FSFO before moving to a practical application, which will be part 5. Okay, guys, look forward to seeing you back for part 4.